Honorable Mr. Michael South Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, I rise to then just a few words in support of both the Barbados Humanitarian Service Award Bill and the Gold Award of Achievement Amendment Bill. There is a young woman, a frontline worker, who's very close to me. Her daughter is also very close to me. And some time ago, her daughter sent her a photo that she had taken, and it was an image of the sunset. And she said, "Mommy never gets to see the sunset because she's working against COVID." She's 6 years old, that's what she said. She said she's working against COVID and she loves the sunset, so I took this picture so she could see it. That, for me, embodies what the people of Barbados, the frontline workers, the people who support the frontline workers, because not all of us are on the front line, but it takes a whole supporting structure. It takes a whole community to be able to respond in the way that this country has been able to respond to this pandemic. And I start there making that point because that particular young lady works in such a supporting role. She is one of the many people who is not a doctor or a nurse or works in a lab, and they have done tremendously important work. But she's one of those people who had to do some of the work of changing the structure of healthcare administration and making sure that apart from the increased number of beds and apart from all of the equipment and the other things that had to be put in place, we also had the people and the institutional arrangements to be able to make all of this happen. And she is one of the people who got up in the morning early and went to work without knowing what would be, if any, the change in remuneration or what would be the arrangements, but really just understanding that this was not business as usual, that this was an emergency situation, and that this was being done, Mr. Speaker, not for the government, but for the people of Barbados. I think that Barbadians came together in this crisis out of an understanding that it was their work that would mean that their neighbors and their families would be able to survive and would be able to live to tell the story. And as we went on, under the leadership of the member for St. Michael Northeast, the Honorable Prime Minister, and the Honorable member for the City of Bridgetown and the member for St. Michael Southeast, and the team. But as we went forward, I do believe that the people of Barbados and those workers were buoyed by the fact that Barbados was starting to distinguish itself as an example in how to handle this crisis. And as I listened to people who worked at the lab or people who worked at the University of the West Indies, and as people came together to talk about how we would manage this, people were motivated, not just because they needed to and wanted to take care of their fellow Barbadian and those who live here, but because there's something about Barbadians, sir, and I heard the Honorable Prime Minister say this in this chamber a little while ago. It is not that we feel we are. It is that we know we are. We are often in the position of being turned to for regional and global leadership. And the people of Barbados knew that this would be such a time. Not just leadership in the international arena, but even leadership in communities, to be able to wear your mask, and to be able to observe the protocols and to be an example in the communities in which they live. And so this is one of the reasons that this Humanitarian Service Award bill and this Gold Award of Achievement and us being able to award it to more than one person and not just at a particular time, that is the reason that these things are so important. I mentioned in particular the University of the West Indies and the Honorable Prime Minister in leading off and the Honorable Minister of, Member for the City of Bridgetown, the Minister of Health, went through all of the different categories. And you know, one of the risks that you run when you try to start to name categories is that you forget somebody and you live in perpetual fear of doing that. So I'm not even going to try and do that. But I do have to acknowledge not just the healthcare administration, and I'll come to other roles that the Ministry of Health and Wellness played in other parts that people might not expect. But I have to acknowledge the University of the West Indies and those who immediately came out and said, listen, there are things that we need to know that we don't yet know. Research is what we do. Modeling is what we do. Forecasting is what we do. Let us help. And, you know, I remember having a conversation with the member for the City of Bridgetown and saying, because, I mean, there are roles that we all have to play. We aren't all the Minister of Health, thank goodness. But there are roles that we all have to play. And I remember having that conversation with him and saying, do we know what our numbers are going to look like? Do we know the things that we will be called on to do as the numbers change? Who is dealing with this forecasting business? Who is looking at this modeling? And that is the conversation that led to the further involvement of the University of the West Indies. And they came with all of their thinking and with all of their explanations and will not only being willing to teach, but willing to learn and being able to share in this collaborative space. And I really have to acknowledge the team that has been doing the research there and has also given some leadership to the global community in terms of how we address this issue of modeling and forecasting. Their work, together with the work of the Ministry of Health and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, also allowed us, and in particular, the chair of the QEH, the PSN team in the Ministry of Health, and the deputy chair of the QEH board, and the team at the QEH as well, allowed us to very quickly put together that operation for the European Investment Bank financing for COVID-related healthcare expenditure. The Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast made the announcement this morning, hot off the press, that we received word that the operation had been approved for up to 50 million euros in COVID-related health expenditure. Now, the reason that we were able to very quickly put that information together, and we certainly know that the European Investment Bank and the European Union tend to require perhaps a lot more detailed information than many of our other partners. But it was because of the tremendous planning in terms of procurement, in terms of knowing exactly what things cost and what you would need. It was because the Ministry of Health and Wellness and the Queen Elizabeth Hospital had done that planning quickly, but had done it, and had the capacity to be able to keep abreast of that information, that we were able to put together all those numbers, and we were able to go back to the European Investment Bank and get these concessional terms for this refinancing. The colleagues from the bank even said to us, this is perhaps the best example of how we've received information and how well thought out and planned out and specific it has been in the countries that we've worked with in this operation. But I want to say something very quickly about why this kind of financing is important. The Ministry of Health and Wellness in 2019 went through an estimates process, just like every other ministry, where they came to us in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment with a program, with some ideas for the expenditure and for the revenue to say, this is what we expect to earn, this is what we expect to spend. I once heard somebody say that COVID is like looking both ways before crossing the street and then getting hit by a plane. And that is really what happened to that ministry. It happened to all of us. But when they came to estimates and they put forward what they put forward, never in a million years would they have believed that they would have to, by January, February, March of the following year, then have to start to really think about, well, how do we finance a response to a pandemic? There's something that people don't often think about in the last 9 months as we've been dealing with this. And it is the fact that this pandemic did not put on pause any other health-related issues. People still got ill from other kinds of things. People still got into accidents, regrettably. People still had fractures and all kinds of other health issues that the health sector in this country had to address. And so what happened, not just in the healthcare sector, but in many other sectors, is that the pandemic sucked all of the air out of the atmosphere. Because when you had planned your resources for certain things at certain times, here comes a pandemic, a 1-in-100-year event, and tells you, oh, you thought you were going so, well, come so. And so what this operation, what this financing, with the help of from the European Investment Bank allows the sector to do, is to then reorient resources to the areas that may have had to wait because we were trying to keep people alive in the context of a pandemic. And so it's very important that we understand that the health sector is one where there are many things to respond to all at once. There are many balls in the air. And I have to say, I have to give the utmost credit and respect to the Minister of Health and Wellness and the team who continued to do an accident emergency and accident emergency expansion, continued to address the issues related to vector-borne diseases and dengue and all of these things, continued to engage, increase the nursing capacity in terms of the nurses from Cuba and from Ghana, continued to roll out the community health workers and all of these other efforts alongside everything that was going on, has now brought a national cancer plan for the country and is really able to walk and chew gum and skin coffins, as we would say, because that is what has been necessary. And while other countries are barely even able to keep abreast of what's happening with the pandemic, the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados is able to not just deal with the pandemic, but also to continue to address all of the other healthcare issues that we have to address on a daily basis. The fact that we had to deal with COVID has called for all kinds of restructuring. And it's not just in the healthcare sector, but there's also certain changes in the structure of the economy and the nature of commerce. And so I say these things because I want us to have the full picture of how so many people in so many sectors and in so many places had to shift and had to adjust and had to come with new ideas. COVID created a new economy in Barbados. When we talk about the legislation that addresses a national payment system, when we talk about modernization, it is because everything had to be shifted quickly. We had to start delivering pharmaceuticals, people's drugs to them. We had operators, we had people who worked in the delivery economy that very quickly rushed in and filled that gap. You know, there are people who called us up and said, listen, has it ever occurred to you that you might be able to use delivery services in this way or in that way? Has it ever occurred to you that we might be able to assist? They didn't ask how much they were getting paid. They didn't ask anything about any arrangements. They came in and they understood that we had to restructure the economy. We had to make way for a digital economy, for a delivery economy, for a gig economy, where the nature of work and the way that we do things was changing. And all those people who came with their ideas, who came with their new business models, all those people we have to acknowledge, and we have to mention them when we talk about how Barbadians have stepped up to the task. On the issue of how we had to deal with financing for COVID, it is not just this recent operation that allows us to address the financing issue. A short while ago, I was able to lay a loan contract that sees the government of Barbados, again, accessing concessional resources. And I have to say concessional resources because I always have to repeat the point that 2 points. All countries borrow. But the second point is that the mere fact of borrowing does not mean that there is something wrong with what a country is doing. We came out of a decade where even if Barbados wanted to borrow from somebody, nobody would allow them. You know when you go into a certain shop and you see these signs that tell you no credit here? That was the position in which Barbados found itself. And the fact that based on our advocacy and based on our fiscal rectitude, we are now in a position of accessing concessional, as in low interest resources over a longer term repayment period, makes our economy more sustainable. And so that loan contract that was laid earlier is for the amount of US $120 million that we now have access to as a policy-based loan to be able to address the fall off in revenue that was caused by COVID. We will shortly lay as well another loan contract that sees us being able to receive US $100 million from the Latin American Development Bank to be able to address the fall off in revenue. And we are discussing with the World Bank for the first time in decades being able to access exceptional borrowing because these are exceptional times. So that is Barbados, excluding the World Bank resources, Barbados $440 million, about the same amount we estimate of the fall off in revenue for this fiscal year that was caused by COVID. I want to say something very clearly before I advance from this point. And it is that there are countries in the world that are trying to get access to borrowing to be able to fill their financing gap and cannot, for various reasons. This period, and the reason that we have been making the case for the ring fencing of COVID-related debt, is that globally, if we are not careful about how we handle global debt in this environment, we are headed for an international debt crisis if we do not carefully plan at an international level. This is not about Barbados, no, because ironically, Barbados least needs the help in terms of how we treat debt in this pandemic and post-pandemic world. But we are doing the advocacy on behalf of our neighbors in this Caribbean region, on behalf of other small island developing states and LDCs, or least developed countries, because if we do not together chart a sustainable debt path for the entire world, the world will be in a debt crisis. Having come through the last 2.5 years that Barbados came through, where we were able to get our debt on a sustainable path. Barbados actually is probably the country that least needs to make this case. But we make the case because no man is an island. And no island is an island in this context. Because whatever happens to the rest of the region and the rest of the world is going to affect us. And I say all of that to say that I want, through you, sir, to disabuse us of the notion that because we borrow, it means that we are not managing the economy well. It is not debt in itself that is problematic. It is making sure that it can be serviced. And under the Burt Plan, we have made sure that the path that we are taking is one that is sustainable and one that we'll be able to service. The last point I want to make, sir, is one that relates to a point that was made by the Honourable Member for St. Michael West in his intervention. It's not often that I find myself in the position of agreeing with the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, but it's the season for all kinds of it's the season for all kinds of miracles. I want to pick up on this question of mental health and resolving conflict. It is a bit unfortunate that the Honourable Member chose, in making the point, speaking about the importance of socialization, he ironically, in making the point about how we need to make sure we continue to invest in young people's resolution of conflict and conflict skills, in illustrating the point, he happened to actually glorify some physical violence that was perpetrated on him when he was a student. So it is a little bit of an uncomfortable illustration that was made, because I do believe that if we want to address some of the mental health and socialization issues that seem to be affecting us more in this pandemic reality, that we have to reject physical violence. And so, apart from the story of being beaten that he used to illustrate the point, the underlying point is one that is sound. Mr. Speaker, we just ended on December 10th, 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. This year, we saw, and it is not by any means an isolated case, but it is perhaps the most recent case that comes to mind, the murder of a young woman by an intimate partner. And it seems to me that apart from the sense of loss and the sense of grief and the senselessness of the act, we were not outraged enough. We heard colleagues from UN Women, the National Organization of Women, and other institutions tell us how, in the context of this pandemic, gender-based violence has increased. I haven't seen specific numbers. Again, I don't think we collect enough data about it, and we need to collect more information. But I don't think that we can have a conversation about how to help people cope, how to address people's mental health, without having a broader national conversation about this other epidemic, this other national health crisis that is taking the lives of Barbadian women. We were too silent, sir, during these 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. Because this is not an effort that can be driven from a department in a ministry. Yes, they need the resources in order to be able to do it, but it calls for action by each Barbadian. It calls for every man to call out and reject the kind of behavior in his friends and his colleagues that suggests that intimate partner violence or gender-based violence or violence against women is okay. It calls for the rejection of that. It calls for all of us to say, listen, it is not okay to speak to her like that. It is not okay to touch her like that. It calls for us in the context of the schools and in community-based groups to not just think we are teaching math and English and coding, but to understand that we are teaching young people how to relate to each other. It is never too early to say to a young boy that is 6 or 7 or 10 or 11, as I do in the communities in St. Michael South Central whenever I see it, it is not too early to say, no, that is a young lady. You must not touch her in that way. Or to say to young girls, it is not all right for you to put hands on somebody in an aggressive way. And so, as I have said to my colleagues in this honorable place before, we are not going to achieve true gender equality unless we address this notion that, or this atmosphere that allows gender-based violence to persist. This is one of the issues when it comes to resolving conflict that we have to speak about. And I do not say it because I am a woman. And I do not step away from it because I am a woman. I think that we all have to be mindful of the fact that we, men and women, bring all kinds of perspectives based on our life experience and not to step back from it. And so what I would say in closing on this debate is that the work that has been done in response to this pandemic has been nothing short of yeoman or yeowoman. It has been nothing short of tremendous. And it is fitting that we acknowledge it, not just with this symbol of appreciation, but as the Honourable Member for St. Michael Northeast, the Honourable Prime Minister said earlier, that we acknowledge it in a tangible financial way to be able to honour the men and women and young people and children who have made their contributions. But I do want to remind us that the work of addressing this pandemic, the work and the transformation of making sure that we continue to live in a harmonious society must continue. And the effort that we have seen has to be applied to other things that ail us. The work that we have seen has to be applied in other places where people are losing their lives because we have not done enough. And so with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I commend these two bills and I'm obliged to you.
Honourable Member for St. George.